Hello folks, it's the Pace Chaser again. Welcome to another video, and this is part 2 of a 3-part series looking at Glenvale Transport GTL buses in Liverpool. Now, I wasn't sure how to title this video, and it probably will have a different title to that because only about the last third or so of it is going to be about GTL. In a short while towards the end of the video, we'll look at the history of Glenvale Transport GTL, but first we need to look at the bus they were most famous for operating, the ex-London Leyland Titan. And we need to ask the question, why did around 300 of these vehicles end up on the streets of Liverpool? To find the answer, we need to go back to December 1969 and the formation of the Merseyside Passenger Transport Executive. Merseyside PTE took over the operations of Liverpool Corporation, Birkenhead Corporation and Wallasey Corporation. In 1973 and 74 they also took over St Helens and Southport, but that's not relevant to our story. Liverpool, Birkenhead and Wallasey bequeathed a varied selection of vehicles to the new PTE, with many different types of chassis and bodywork. Quite a number of them were getting old, some still in remarkably good condition, and some perhaps politely described as serviceable. In the picture now we've got Birkenhead fleet number 374, seen at the Woodside Ferry and Bus Terminal in Birkenhead. Registered EBG 61, it was a Guy Arab 4 with massive bodywork, new in June 1956, and it passed to Merseyside PTE in December of 1969. The new PTE wished to improve the age profile of their fleet, whilst also having more standardisation in chassis and body manufacture, and therefore in spare parts stock, and also increasing the number of vehicles suitable for what was then known as one-man operation. Back in the late 60s and early 70s there was quite a long lead time between ordering buses and actually taking delivery of them. Hence all new arrivals with the PTE in 1970 and 1971 had been ordered by the constituent fleets, had indeed had the 4 buses that arrived in December 1969 after the PTE was formed. The last bus ordered by one of the constituents, in this case Liverpool, arrived in April 1972 in the form of Atlantean 1235 XKC 862K, but otherwise the rest of the 1972 deliveries were buses that had been ordered by Merseyside PTE themselves. In the illustration we can see one of the ones that the constituent companies ordered, not vehicle 1235 but sister vehicle 1212, ordered by Liverpool Corporation but delivered to Merseyside PTE in December of 1971, registered XKC 839K. As we can see here, it was later sold to Isle of Man Transport and re-registered MAN 5339. And it's seen here withdrawn at Douglas Garage in September of 1998. Unfortunately, she would never return to the mainland, being scrapped on the Isle of Man in 2011. Of the buses ordered by the PTE, one type in particular is relevant to our story, the Alexander-bodied Leyland Atlantean. Now, they weren't the same as the ones ordered by Liverpool that we've just seen. The Liverpool ones were long wheelbase and had 2 doors, but the PTE standard ones were standard wheelbase or short wheelbase and had just 1 door. However, other types were delivered as well. In 1972, 20 Metro Scania single-deckers arrived. 1973 brought 50 Daimler Fleetlines with MCW bodywork and also 50 East Lancashire-bodied Leyland Atlanteans, whilst 1974 saw the arrival of 20 Metropolitan double-deckers and 2 Leyland minibuses. Generally, these types are not relevant to our story as they were replaced relatively early. For example, the Scania-based Metropolitans did only 10 years with Merseyside PTE before withdrawal and sale, and therefore they have no bearing on the story of Leyland Titans in Liverpool. We're currently looking at one of the Scania Metropolitans, RKA 437N, new as Merseyside PTE 4037 in October 1974, and seen here after sale to KHCT in Hull, with whom it became fleet number 437. The beading on these buses was placed where the green and cream of the Merseyside livery met. Hull painted their blue and white colours in the former Merseyside proportions to avoid the buses looking odd. RKA 437N passed from Hull to Cams of Nottingham and then to Nightline of Torquay, neither of whom repainted it. Over the 3 years 1972, 1973 and 1974, 323 Alexander-bodied Atlanteans to PTE specification were delivered, 109 in 1972, 145 in 1973 and 69 in 1974, and many more to the same specification arrived in subsequent years. Illustrating the type is fleet number 1493 GKA 493M, delivered in August 1973 and seen in Laird Street Garage, Birkenhead. This bus was due in the short-lived blue and cream Wirral area livery before the PTE standardised on the former Liverpool area green and cream as the normal livery for all of its buses. The problem with buying a lot of new buses in a short period of time is that they all need replacing at once. In the early 70s, buses still did not need an MOT certificate in the conventional way. Instead, they came with a 7-year certificate of fitness when brand new. When this expired, the vehicle was submitted for examination and, if up to scratch, a new certificate of fitness would be issued, generally for 5 years. But to obtain this, the bus had to be in virtually as new condition, and this is why most larger operators had an engineering works where they could strip down and rebuild their buses, Merseyside's being the ex-Liverpool facility at Edge Lane. Most operators aim for a 12-year life, so the 300 plus Atlanteans delivered in 1972, 3 and 4 would need replacing between 1984 and 1986. At the time, this wasn't seen as a problem. The PTE had only just been formed in the early 70s, so they'd surely still be there. They'd have plenty of money, and what could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a bit. For a start, ridership, which had been declining steadily since the late 1950s, continued to do so, and fewer passengers meant less revenue. Then the government bus grant, which had been introduced and saw the government pay up to 50% of the price of a new vehicle, was phased out and then withdrawn altogether in the early 1980s, meaning that operators had to pay the full purchase costs of the vehicles themselves. The cost of everything went up, including new buses, and finally there was much uncertainty regarding the forthcoming deregulation and privatisation of the bus industry. In 1980, the certificate of fitness system was abolished shortly after the batches of Atlanteans were considering had been rebuilt, and going forward buses simply received conventional MOTs on an annual basis, so there was no requirement to rebuild them, and as such the vehicles delivered in the mid-70s after the ones that we're considering were not rebuilt, and this would have consequences further down the line. At deregulation in 1986, Merseyside PTE, in common with all the other PTEs and council-owned bus operators, was required to set up what was known as an arm's length company to run its bus services. It was run like a normal private company, but the PTE still held all of the shares. The arm's length company was Merseyside Transport Limited, with the catchier trading name of Merseybus displayed on the buses. Initially, Merseybus used the former PTE green and cream livery, as depicted here by the Atlantean on the far left of this view. In around 1988, the livery was changed to maroon and cream, sported by Eastern Coachworks bodied Leyland Olympian 0031 ACM 705X, which had been new in January 1982, and 0063 DEM 763Y, an unusual Alexander RH bodied MCW Metrobus, new in September of 1982. 0031 was sold by Merseybus to Midland Fox and then worked for Cedric's of Wivenhoe in Essex before being preserved by the Merseyside Transport Trust. 0063 had a slightly more unusual second life. PSV service with Bluebird of Middleton near Manchester was followed by a spell as a mobile tattoo parlour in Bedfordshire, and then conversion into a motorhome, firstly based in Cumbria and then in Weston-super-Mare. It was last photographed and recorded by the DVLA in 2015, although the latter incorrectly had it listed as a Scania, and it may or may not still exist. Does anyone actually know? In the run-up to deregulation, the PTE hadn't had the money to replace the Atlanteans that we were considering, the early 70s ones, so they passed into Merseybus ownership. Still with no money to replace them, they simply soldiered on. Merseybus did manage to purchase modest amounts of new buses, Metrobuses and Leyland Olympians, but they replaced fleet lines and some of the Atlanteans with less robust makes of bodywork. In the meantime, the balance sheet suffered further as a result of competition. At times it seems as if every man and his dog had turned up on the streets of Liverpool in a bus. One of the better independent competitors to appear in Liverpool was CMT buses, initially trading as C&M Travel. At first they ran an ever-increasing fleet of Leyland Nationals such as K&H 500N, which had been new to United Counties in July 1975, and is seen in this view in central Liverpool with Merseybus Atlantean 1044, registered a 124 HLV and new in March 1984 in hot pursuit. In December 1992, Merseyside Transport Limited was privatised by a sale to its management and employees. The sale was unusual in that managers did not get preferential shareholdings. All staff were allocated shares on the basis of length of service and not grade, and therefore the largest shareholder was a gentleman who worked in the body shop and had 40 years' service. The privatised company was known as MTL Holdings and will take us to Glenvale eventually, but first, what about those Titans? With many ageing Atlanteans still in the fleet, and with the unrebuilt mid-1970s examples now in a far worse condition than their rebuilt early 70s counterparts, replacement was a priority. At about this time, London buses were just beginning to withdraw their fleet of Leyland Titans, although the type would last in mainstream service in London until 2002. Merseybus did some trials with one and agreed to purchase at least 160 plus some extras for spare parts. In the event, MTL and GTL purchased around 250 directly from London, and in addition MTL acquired in the region of 40 more with the takeover of independents in the area, especially Village Group, Tours and Liverpool, the latter also having a London-based subsidiary, London Suburban Buses. Approximately 20 other Titans worked for operators in the Liverpool and Wirral areas without passing to MTL. The full list of independents in the area who operated ex-London Titans is as follows. Cass of Wirral, Castle Buses, Cherry, Coachmasters, Diamond Travel, Fleetlink, Liverbus, Liverpool City Bus, Liverpool Motor Services, Merseyline, People's Bus, Village Tours and Wingates. Some of these employed ex-Merseybus staff or had been set up by ex-Merseybus staff or managers, and they were already familiar with Leyland Titans. Some of them just saw what everybody else was running and got some of those. Some of them bought them simply because they were available. There were large numbers coming out of London service at the time, and some others set up as dealers and then kept a couple for their own fleets. But of course the answer as to why Merseybus bought them is that they wanted to replace the older Atlanteans, particularly the mid-70s ones that were in poor condition. The privatised MTL made a promising start to its operations, despite the ageing Atlanteans still being present. The spare parts situation for which was so dire that many buses with working gearboxes had two of the gears removed to donate to other vehicles where the gearbox had failed completely. As a result, many of the Atlanteans either had just first and third or second and fourth gears. I must admit I was disappointed when I read about that in the 2000s in an article, because I visited Liverpool in 1995 and came back with the impression that all Merseybus drivers were hellfire thrash merchants, to use enthusiast terminology, because the Atlanteans were howling and screaming round the place, but actually it was just because they were in the wrong gear for around 50% of the time. A steady influx of Leyland Titans from London was brought in alongside new vehicles. New vehicle deliveries stepped up, and there was also the purchase of some of the competitors such as Fairway and Liverbus, an expansion into Manchester and also an expansion into coaching activities in North Lancashire with Heysham Travel. This saw the balance sheet improve, and MTL were able to report a modest profit in early 1994 compared to a stonking £8 million loss in 1991. However, all was not rosy. In October 1994, MTL purchased London Northern as part of the privatisation of London buses, which took place after the privatisation of buses elsewhere. It rebranded the operation as MTL London. The London Suburban Buses subsidiary of Gemsam Holdings, who owned Liverbus, was added about a year or so later. However, the London operation ran up debts of over £8 million and was sold to Metroline in August 1998. Whilst we've been considering that, we've been looking at a fairly typical example of the Leyland Titan, this one complete with single door conversion done by Edge Lane Works in Liverpool. The bus is 2424 KYV 424X, seen at the Manchester Museum of Transport, in a photograph by G. Hunt, licensed under Wikimedia Commons licence 2.0. Most of the other photos where I've not mentioned the photographer are just from my collection. I don't know who the original photographer was on them, but as I say, this one was by G. Hunt and used under Wikimedia Commons. New to London Transport in February 1982 as fleet number T424, this bus arrived in Liverpool in June 1993. Edge Lane converted as many of the buses as they could to single door when they arrived, and 2424 was in fact done on arrival, but some were never converted and returned the two doors throughout their life in the northwest. 2424 passed through the takeover by Arriva and GTL, which we'll discuss shortly, still as fleet number 2424, and then when GTL sold out to Stagecoach, which again we'll discuss in a little bit further on in time, it became Stagecoach fleet number 10424. Happily, the bus passed into preservation in 2006 and it's seen here in early preservation days. Meanwhile, in 1997, MTL had entered the world of railways when it was awarded the Regional Railways North East and Merseyrail franchises. Rail privatisation had been touted as a surefire way to make money, and MTL's motivation for entering the market was apparently to earn enough to finally complete its fleet replacements. Although by this point the early and mid-70s Atlanteans had finally been retired, there was still a large number of newer versions of the Atlantean, which by this time were between 13 and 15 years old, and which were becoming ever increasingly expensive to maintain and to keep in fuel. Plus there were many Leyland National single-deckers of about a similar age, and of course the Titans would need replacing before much longer. However, in the early days, rail privatisation was not a cash cow, and most operators found themselves barely breaking even or even making a loss, including MTL. In 1998, the individual fleet names carried by the buses around Merseyside, including Merseybus, Wirral Peninsula, Southport, Lancashire Travel, Merseyrider and MTL Fairway, were replaced with a rather utilitarian-looking MTL North brand. On the 17th of February 2000, MTL was sold to Arriva for £85 million, with the employee shareholders each receiving a payment of around £13,500. However, the Monopolies and Mergers Commission were not happy. Many services radiating from Liverpool to other towns and cities, plus some of the services in Liverpool itself, were run by what had until recently been North Western and its Liverline subsidiary, recently rebranded as Arriva North West. Liverline had previously been one of the many independents running on the streets of Liverpool, but was bought by North Western, and we see here one of its former vehicles in North Western style livery, Atlantean XPG 171T, new to London Country, and by the time of this view in operation with Appleby's in Hull. Arriva North West encompassed not only the former North Western and Liverline, but also the former B-Line operation in Manchester, with an operational area stretching down into Cheshire. The addition of the bulk of Liverpool and Wirral services plus the local Merseyrail train services was too much for the Monopolies and Mergers Commission, and they launched an investigation which concluded by saying that Arriva should sell the large depot at Gilmoss in North Liverpool to another operator. Thanks to some canny negotiation, Arriva reached an agreement that they could transfer the more modern vehicles out of Gilmoss, with the exception of a handful required for contracted routes, and replace them with older buses. So out came the newer buses, and in went a large number of ageing Titans and MCW Metro buses. The operation was temporarily known as Gilmoss buses until a buyer was found. In addition to the best buses, Arriva also managed to arrange to keep the best routes. Hence the lucrative 12 and 13 Stockbridge Village circulars, 14 Croxteth and 53 and 55 Thornton or Old Roan stayed with Arriva and were transferred to the garages at Bootle and Green Lane as appropriate. Go Ahead expressed interest in Gilmoss but then pulled out, and the lack of a buyer led Arriva to approach the MMC and ask to keep hold of the depot in exchange for them investing heavily in it. However, this was refused and the search for a buyer continued. Eventually a number of buyers emerged and were shortlisted, these being CMT buses, remember them, Delgro, Stagecoach and MTL Gilmoss Limited. The latter was a management buyout led by Dominic Brady and Ian Campbell, and was announced as a successful bidder, taking over operations on the 15th of July 2001 and immediately being renamed Glenvale Transport Limited with a displayed fleet name of GTL. It was decided to retain MTL's cream and deep red livery as the Arriva operation would move into their corporate turquoise and cream colours, or aquamarine and Cotswold stone as it was known officially. As part of the ruling requiring Arriva to sell Gilmoss, they were banned from competing with whoever bought the operation on its own routes, as in the ones that were already running from Gilmoss Depot for 3 years after the purchase. GTL took advantage of this by running in competition on some of the Arriva routes in other parts of Liverpool, such as the south and the east, such as routes 79 and 82. To facilitate this, more Titans were brought from London operators during 2001 and 2002, along with a quantity of Dennis Darts and a few more Metro buses. Meanwhile, CMT buses have been plugging away. The Leyland Nationals have been replaced largely with new low-floor buses, but also with some second-hand Leyland Lynxes and Volvo B10Bs. And in March 1999, ABC Traveller Formby had been acquired, with its fleet of modern vehicles used on a number of Merseytravel contracts, Merseytravel being the trading name of the PTE by this point. On the 15th of June 2003, CMT was purchased by Glenvale, the sale including CMT's depot in Aintree. For a few months the CMT name was kept, however in October 2003 management of the Aintree operation was moved to Gilmoss and the vehicles began to carry GTL fleet names. At around the same time GTL adopted the CMT livery of all over red for its operations, presumably it being quicker and cheaper to paint. Despite promising to invest in new vehicles on several occasions, GTL did not, and narrowly avoided having its operator's licence reduced at a public inquiry in late 2003. Part of the problem was the cost of maintaining and operating the increasingly aged Leyland Titans and MCW Metro buses, and so in late 2003 a start was made on replacing them, not with new buses as promised, but instead using second-hand Dennis Darts and Volvo B6s, ranging from 9 to 12 years old. The positive aspects of these buses, which by early 2005 totalled around 70 units, was that they were cheaper to operate and maintain, although the B6s tended to suffer from problems, which explains why they were available to purchase in the first place. The downside was that they were not really big enough for the routes that GTL operated on. The ban on Arriva competing with GTL expired in 2004, and perhaps predictably given GTL's behaviour towards Arriva registered routes or competing routes on most of GTL's core services. By spring 2005, Glenvale had around £7 million of debts, and rumours began to circulate in the industry that it was heading for collapse. In June 2005, drivers threatened to strike due to wages not being paid on time, which the company put down to a banking error. Shortly afterwards, the company was advertised for sale. Early interest was shown by Keolis, Transdev and National Express. Go Ahead were also tempted once again until they looked at the books and looked around the depot, after which they decided that the problems were too great and walked away. And so it fell to Stagecoach to buy Glenvale. It would take more than a few knackered Titans to scare Brian Souter. The sale went through on the 13th of July 2005. Stagecoach paid £3.2 million for the operation, but in addition agreed to take on £7.8 million worth of accrued debts. The company was swiftly rebranded Stagecoach Merseyside, and a large number of new Dennis Dart SLFs arrived, along with older Volvo B10Ms, Dennis Darts and Leyland Olympians transferred from elsewhere in the Stagecoach group. And so we head towards the end of the video. It seems to become fashionable in recent years to have a go at GTL on forums and etc. 20 years after they ceased to exist. But in my own opinion, they largely did the best they could with the hand they were dealt, i.e. old buses and routes whose financial performance was not always particularly exciting. Possibly it was a poor decision to spend money competing with Arriva instead of buying new buses and investing in the core operation. But without the purchasing power of a large group, GTL was always likely to struggle. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, there is a like button if you'd like to press it. That would be much appreciated. As I said, this is part 2 of a series of 3 looking at Glenvale Transport GTL. In part 1 we reviewed the EFE model of a Leyland Titan and GTL livery, the one you're looking at now on the screen. In part 3 we'll look at some of the photos of GTL buses that I've got in my collection, including some of the ones that have been illustrated in this particular part here. If you're watching this as it comes out, the part 3 should be out about a week afterwards. Obviously if you're watching it after it's been out a while, part 3 will already be out. I will put a link to parts 1 and 3 in the description to this video as well. But once again, I hope you have enjoyed watching it. Thank you for watching, take care, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.